Hey, stuffers. If you thought your book club drama was intense because Karen hated the ending of Where the Crawdads Sing, wait until you hear about the novel that literally had governments issuing death warrants. Alex here, and welcome back to Stuff with Alex. Picture this, September 26, 1988, a Tuesday. Most people are worried about normal Tuesday things, traffic, deadlines, whether they remembered to record Cheers on their VCR. Meanwhile, in publishing houses across London and New York, editors are holding their breath as they prepare to release what they believe will be a challenging but important work of literary fiction. The author, Salman Rushdie, already a critically acclaimed writer, winner of the Booker Prize, a darling of the literary establishment. The book, The Satanic Verses, a sprawling, ambitious postmodern novel exploring themes of migration, identity, religious doubt, and cultural collision. Within 6 months, bookstores would be firebombed, translators would be murdered, riots would erupt across 3 continents, leaving dozens dead. The author would be forced into hiding under armed protection, and the supreme leader of Iran, a man who'd never read the book in a language he didn't speak, would issue a religious decree calling for Rushdie's execution, offering a bounty that would eventually reach over $3 million. One novel, one work of fiction, and suddenly the entire world was forced to confront questions we thought we'd already answered. What are the limits of free expression? Can art be dangerous? Is any idea worth dying for, worth killing for? But here's what makes this story even more complex, stuffers. The Satanic Verses controversy wasn't a simple tale of artistic freedom versus religious extremism. It was a geopolitical powder keg involving Cold War tensions, post-colonial resentments, Iranian revolutionary politics, British racism, American foreign policy, and the fundamental clash between Enlightenment values and religious authority, all detonated by a single book that the most of the people protesting it had never actually read. And here's the thing that'll really bake your noodle. Over 35 years later, we're still living in the shadow of what happened. The Fatwa has never been rescinded. In August of 2022, yes, 2022, not 1989, Salman Rushdie was brutally stabbed on stage at a literary event in New York, losing sight in one eye and the use of one hand. The book that was supposed to spark literary conversation instead sparked a war over ideas that's still being fought today, in ways both obvious and invisible. This is the comprehensive story of the Satanic Verses, from its creation and controversial content, through the global firestorm that followed its publication, to the assassination attempt that brought it all roaring back into relevance in 2022, and the larger questions about freedom, fear, and faith that continue to haunt us in 2026. To understand the Satanic Verses, you first need to understand Salman Rushdie, because this book is in many ways his life story disguised as magical realist fiction. Ahmed Salman Rushdie was born on June 19, 1947 in Bombay, India, just 2 months before the partition that would split British India into India and Pakistan, one of the bloodiest mass migrations in human history. Think about that timing. He literally came into the world as one version of his homeland was dying, and 2 new, violently contested nations were being born. His family was Muslim, but not particularly religious. His father was a Cambridge-educated businessman with secular leanings, his mother from a Kashmiri family. In 1961, when Rushdie was 14, his parents sent him to rugby school in England, one of those prestigious British boarding schools where they teach you Latin and emotional repression in equal measure. Culture shock doesn't begin to cover it. Here's this kid from Bombay, brown-skinned, brilliant, steeped in Indian culture and storytelling traditions, suddenly dropped into the middle of 1960s England, where he's immediately othered, exoticized, made to feel perpetually foreign. He's too Indian for England, But after years there, he's becoming too English for India. He's caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither. Sound familiar? It should, because it's literally the central theme of the Satanic Verses. Rushdie went to Cambridge, studied history, graduated in 1968, the year of global revolution, of students in Paris tearing up cobblestones, of Prague Spring and assassinations and the world seeming to crack open. He worked in advertising for a while, writing the famous "naughty but nice" slogan for cream cakes, which is both hilarious and somehow perfect. But his real passion was fiction. His first novel, Grimace, 1975, was a commercial and critical flop, but his second, Midnight's Children, 1981, was a phenomenon, a magical realist epic about children born at the exact moment of Indian independence, each with supernatural powers. It won the Booker Prize. It won the Booker of Bookers. Critics lost their minds over it. Suddenly, Rushdie was being mentioned in the same breath as Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Günter Grass. He followed it up with Shame, 1983, a political allegory about Pakistan that was banned there, but further cemented his reputation as a bold, fearless writer willing to satirize power and religious authority. By 1988, Rushdie was at the peak of his career, wealthy, celebrated, married to the American novelist Marianne Wiggins, living between London and New York. He was that perfect combination of literary respectability and commercial success. He could write whatever he wanted. So he decided to write a book about everything: migration, faith, doubt, revelation, identity, history, love, betrayal, transformation. He wanted to explore what it meant to be a person caught between cultures, between the sacred and the profane, between the past and the future. He wanted to write about how revelation happens, how ideas fall from the sky and change people, for better or worse. He also wanted to examine one of the most controversial moments in Islamic history, the story of the Satanic Verses themselves. And that's where everything went sideways. Okay, stuffers, let's address the elephant in the room. Most of the people who were burning this book, protesting it, calling for its author's death, they hadn't read it. Couldn't have read it. It wasn't even translated into Persian or Urdu when the fatwa was issued. So what's actually in the Satanic Verses? Buckle up, because this is complicated, dense, and weird in the best postmodern literary tradition. The novel is 546 pages of fragmented narrative, magical realism, dreams within dreams, and multiple storylines that blur together. It opens with a terrorist bombing of a plane called Air India Flight 420, because Rushdie loves symbolic numbers. 420 is Indian slang for a confidence trickster. 2 men fall from the exploding plane 29,000 feet above the English Channel and somehow survive. One is Gibril Farishta. Notice the name. Gibril is Gabriel. Farishta is angel. A Bollywood movie star who made his career playing Hindu gods and is having a crisis of faith. The other is Saladin Chamcha. Chamcha means spoon or sycophant in Urdu. An Indian-born voice actor who spent his whole life trying to become more English than the English. As they fall, they begin to transform. Gibril starts sprouting a halo. Saladin starts growing horns and hooves. They're literally becoming an angel and a devil, but which is which keeps shifting. They survive the fall, magic realism baby, and wash up on a British beach where the police immediately arrest Saladin, because of course they do, he's brown and has horns now, while practically worshipping Gibril, who has that angelic glow. Rushdie is not subtle about his commentary on British racism. But here's where it gets controversial. Gibril Farishta starts having these intense dreams, or are they hallucinations, or visions, in which he becomes the Archangel Gibril, the Islamic name for Gabriel. In these dream sequences, he witnesses events from early Islamic history. One sequence features a businessman in the city of Jahiliyyah, a thinly veiled version of pre-Islamic Mecca, who receives revelations from the angel Gibril. This businessman is called Mahond, a medieval European derogatory name for the Prophet Muhammad. Let me be crystal clear here. Rushdie is writing a fictional dream sequence inside a fictional character's imagination about a fictionalized version of historical events. It's layers of narrative distance, but those layers didn't matter to a lot of people. In this dream sequence, Mahond receives verses that seem to acknowledge three goddesses worshipped in pre-Islamic Arabia: Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat. These verses appear to compromise strict monotheism, and they get people very excited because now they can keep worshipping these goddesses while also accepting the new strictly monotheistic faith. But then, plot twist, the angel returns and says basically, yeah, those verses, my bad. Those were actually from Satan, not God. Retract them. The followers are confused and angry. Some leave. The revelation is clarified. There is only one God, no partners, no compromises. This is based on a historical incident documented in early Islamic sources called the Satanic Verses incident. Scholars debate its authenticity, many reject it as fabricated, but it appears in respected early sources like Ibn Ishaq's biography of Muhammad and Tabari's history. Rushdie isn't inventing this story, he's dramatically reimagining a historical narrative that's been debated by Islamic scholars for over 1,000 years. But wait, there's more. Another dream sequence takes place in a brothel in Jahiliyyah, where the prostitutes take on the names of Mahond's wives and perform, well, services while role-playing as these holy women. Yeah, that's in there too. Now, Rushdie's defenders, and I think this is important, would argue that, 1, these are explicitly dreams and hallucinations of a mentally unstable character. 2, the novel is exploring doubt, faith, the nature of revelation, and human imperfections. 3, it's a postmodern text that deliberately blurs lines between reality and fiction to make philosophical points. 4, Rushdie is himself from a Muslim background and is engaging with his own tradition in a complex, questioning way. But his critics would argue, 1, doesn't matter if it's a dream, you're still depicting the prophet in forbidden ways. 2, you're giving credence to a disputed historical incident that undermines the divine nature of the Quran. 3, you're depicting the prophet's wives in a brothel, which is obscene and blasphemous. 4, the use of the derogatory name Mahond shows contempt regardless of narrative distance. Stuffers, I'm genuinely curious. Should there be any limits on how religion is depicted in fiction, not legally, but ethically? Drop your thoughts in the comments, but keep it respectful. The rest of the book deals with Saladin and Gabriel's experiences in Thatcher's England, dealing with racism, cultural dislocation, identity crisis, madness. Gabriel has an affair with a woman named Alleluia, subtle, right? Becomes increasingly unstable, and eventually murders her in a fit of jealous rage before killing himself. Saladin gradually sheds his devil form and reconciles with his dying father in Bombay, accepting his hybrid identity. It's a book about transformation, migration, the death and rebirth of the self. It's deeply personal for Rushdie. It's basically his autobiography filtered through magical realism and theological speculation. It's also, undeniably, a book that takes enormous liberties with Islamic historical history in ways that many Muslims would find offensive, regardless of the author's intent or the layers of narrative framing. Both things can be true. The Satanic Verses was published by Viking Penguin on September 26, 1988 in the UK. The first reviews were mixed, actually. Some critics loved it, calling it ambitious and brilliant. Others found it messy and self-indulgent. The Times literary supplement praised its dazzling prose. The New York Times was more lukewarm. Nobody predicted what was coming. The first protests came from within Britain itself, specifically from Muslim communities in Bradford, Blackburn, and Bolton. And this is important context. British Muslim communities in the late 1980s were predominantly working class, often from Pakistan and Bangladesh, facing significant discrimination and economic marginalization. These communities felt ignored, disrespected, and under siege from a society that seemed hostile to their very existence. Then along comes this book, written by someone from a Muslim background, published to great fanfare by the literary establishment, that seems to mock their most sacred beliefs. It felt like a betrayal, like the final insult added to decades of injury. On December 2nd, 1988, thousands of Muslims marched through Bolton protesting the book. In January 1989, they marched in Bradford. And on January 14th, 1989, they did something that would become the defining image of the controversy. They publicly burned copies of the Satanic Verses in front of TV cameras. The imagery was explosive, literally. Book burning carries a very specific historical weight, especially in Europe. It evokes the Nazis burning degenerate books in the 1930s. It evokes the Inquisition. It evokes every totalitarian impulse to control thought and suppress ideas. Suddenly, this wasn't just a literary controversy, it was a culture war flashpoint. The liberal establishment in Britain rallied around the principle of free expression. Muslim community leaders felt unheard and disrespected. Everyone was talking about the book. Almost nobody was actually discussing what was in the book. Then India banned the book in October 1988, before the UK protests even started, worried about communal violence. Then South Africa banned it, then Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Somalia, Bangladesh, Sudan, Malaysia, Indonesia, Qatar, all these countries banned it, most without the populations having any way to actually read it. Meanwhile, in Iran, something else was happening. Ayatollah Khomeini was 86 years old in February 1989. He'd led the Iranian Revolution a decade earlier, overthrowing the Shah and establishing an Islamic republic. He was the supreme leader, the ultimate religious and political authority in Iran. He was also, by early 1989, a man whose revolution was struggling. The Iran-Iraq War had just ended after 8 brutal years, leaving Iran economically devastated and psychologically scarred. Khomeini's more pragmatic rivals within the Iranian leadership were gaining influence. The revolutionary fervor was waning. Khomeini needed a way to reassert his authority, to reignite the revolutionary spirit, to remind the world and his own people that he was still the uncompromising defender of Islam against Western corruption. Enter the Satanic Verses. On February 12, 1989, there was a violent protest against the book in Islamabad, Pakistan. Police fired on protesters. 6 people died. 2 days later, on February 14, 1989, Valentine's Day, because irony is the universe's favorite hobby, Khomeini issued his fatwa. Here's the key portion. I inform the proud Muslim people of the world that the author of the Satanic Verses book, which is against Islam, the Prophet, and the Quran, and all those involved in its publication who were aware of its content, are sentenced to death. I ask all Muslims to execute them wherever they find them. Just to be clear what this means, Khomeini, who had never read the book, it wasn't translated into Persian, who didn't speak English, issued a religious decree sentencing to death not just the author, but anyone involved in publishing or distributing the book, anywhere in the world, forever. This wasn't a legal prosecution. This was a hit order, a religiously sanctioned assassination contract on a citizen of another country for the crime of writing a novel. The Iranian government backed it up with a bounty, $2.6 million, later increased to over $3 million. The reaction was immediate and global. Britain broke diplomatic relations with Iran. The European community, pre-EU, withdrew its ambassadors. Free speech advocates were outraged. Publishing houses around the world had to make impossible decisions. Do we publish this book and risk the lives of our employees? Do we cave to threats and validate censorship through violence? Many chose to publish it anyway, not necessarily because they loved the book, but because surrendering to violent threats felt like betraying everything liberal democracy stood for. But here's where it gets even more complex. Why did Khomeini really issue the fatwa? Some scholars argue it was purely ideological. a genuine belief that Rushdie had committed blasphemy worthy of death. Others argue it was largely political, a way for Khomeini to outflank his rivals, embarrass more moderate Muslim leaders who'd been slow to condemn the book, and reassert Iran's leadership of the global Islamic revolution. There's evidence for both. Khomeini was a true believer, but he was also a shrewd political operator who understood the power of symbolic gestures. What's undeniable is that the fatwa worked, at least for Khomeini's immediate goals. It put Iran back at the center of the global stage. It forced every Muslim leader to take a position. It made Khomeini, once again, the uncompromising defender of Islamic honor against Western blasphemy. That it also sentenced a novelist to death and plunged the world into a crisis over free expression? Acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of revolutionary purity. On February 14, 1989, Salman Rushdie was at home in London when his wife told him to turn on the television. He watched the news reports about the fatwa. He later described his first reaction as disbelief, then a weird sense of unreality, like he'd stepped into one of his own magical realist novels. Within hours, British police arrived at his home. They told him his life was in immediate danger. They told him he needed to go into hiding. They told him he should think about where he'd be safe, who he could trust. They told him this might last a few months. It lasted over a decade. Rushdie adopted the code name Joseph Anton after Joseph Conrad and Anton Chekhov, his literary heroes. He was moved from safe house to safe house, always with armed protection, never staying anywhere long. His wife left him within a year. Can you blame her? He couldn't tell his friends where he was. He couldn't attend his own book launches or award ceremonies. He missed his children growing up. The British government spent millions protecting him. Estimates range from £1 to £3 million per year. Some British taxpayers resented this. Why should they pay to protect some writer who'd known what he was doing when he wrote that book? Others saw it differently. If the British government allowed a writer to be murdered for exercising free speech, what message did that send? What precedent did that set? Meanwhile, people connected to the book were being attacked. On July 3, 1991, Hitoshi Igarashi, the Japanese translator of the Satanic Verses, was stabbed to death at Tsukuba University. On July 11, 1991, Ettore Capriolo, the Italian translator, was stabbed at his home in Milan. He survived. On October 11, 1993, William Nygaard, the Norwegian publisher, was shot 3 times outside his home in Oslo. He survived. In 1993, a mob in Turkey protesting the book's publication there set fire to a hotel, killing 37 people, mostly there for a cultural festival having nothing to do with Rushdie. These weren't theoretical threats. People were dying. And through it all, Rushdie was trapped in a life of surreal imprisonment, free in theory, imprisoned in practice, unable to live anything resembling a normal life. He tried negotiating. In 1990, he even issued a statement expressing regret if the book had caused offense and claiming he'd become closer to Islam. He was hoping this might lead to the fatwa being lifted. It didn't work. Hardliners in Iran said the fatwa was irrevocable. Even if Rushdie became the most pious man of all time, the death sentence stood. So he went back into hiding and kept writing. Because what else could he do? Over the years, he published Haroun and the Sea of Stories, a children's book that's actually about censorship and the power of stories. The Moor's Last Sigh, The Ground Beneath Her Feet. He dated models and actresses, Padma Lakshmi most famously. He appeared occasionally at public events with heavy security. He lived a strange half-life, famous but hidden, celebrated but endangered. In 1998, Iran's reformist president Mohammad Khatami said his government would do nothing to implement the fatwa. Not a withdrawal, just a "we're not actively trying to kill you" declaration. It was something. Gradually, Rushdie emerged from hiding. He started living more publicly, attending events, accepting awards. He became a champion of free expression, speaking out whenever artists or writers faced censorship or violence. By the 2000s, the immediate danger seemed to have passed. The fatwa was still technically in effect, still is actually, but it seemed like a historical artifact, a relic of a more confrontational era. Except it wasn't. Stuffers, hit that like button if you already know where this is going and your stomach just dropped. Chautauqua Institution in Western New York is about as American and wholesome as it gets. It's a lakeside cultural center that hosts lectures, concerts, and educational programs. Think TED Talks meets summer camp for adults. Very earnest, very civilized, very safe. On August 12, 2022, Salman Rushdie was scheduled to give a lecture there about writers who serve as safe havens for other persecuted writers. The irony would soon become unbearable. Rushdie, now 75 years old, walked on stage around 10:45 a.m. The moderator introduced him. As Rushdie sat down and began to speak, a man rushed the stage from the audience. His name was Hadi Matar, 24 years old, from New Jersey. He stabbed Rushdie approximately 10 to 15 times in the neck, face, and abdomen before being tackled by audience members and security. The attack lasted less than 30 seconds. Paramedics airlifted Rushdie to a hospital in Erie, Pennsylvania. His injuries were catastrophic: a damaged liver, severed nerves in his arm, wounds to his eye and chest. He was on a ventilator, unable to speak. For days, it wasn't clear if he'd survive. He did survive, but barely. He lost sight in his right eye. He lost the use of his left hand. He has permanent nerve damage. A man who made his living with words can no longer write by hand. The global reaction was shock and horror. This was supposed to be over. The fatwa was a 1989 problem, a Cold War relic. Rushdie had been living relatively openly for years. How did this happen? Hadi Matar, when questioned by police, was straightforward about his motive. He'd seen YouTube videos criticizing Rushdie, knew about the fatwa, considered Rushdie an enemy of Islam. He acted alone, no direct connection to Iran or any organized group. Just a young man radicalized by online content and decades-old religious grievances. This is what's called stochastic terrorism. When you create an environment of hatred and threats around a target, you don't need to directly order violence. Eventually, someone, somewhere will take it upon themselves to act. The fatwa, still officially in effect, still praised and reinforced by hardliners, created the conditions. Matar pulled the trigger, wielded the knife. Iran's response? State media celebrated the attack. Conservative newspapers ran headlines like, "A knife has landed in the neck of the enemy." Some reformist voices expressed concern, but the dominant narrative in state-controlled media was barely concealed glee. Rushdie eventually recovered enough to write about the experience. In 2024, he published Knife: Meditations After an Attempted Murder, a memoir about the attack and its aftermath. In it, he describes the surreal experience of hearing the fatwa praised all over again, of realizing that 33 years later, he was still a target, still paying the price for a book he'd written in the 1980s. As of January 2026, Hadi Matar is still awaiting trial in New York on charges of attempted murder and assault. He's pleaded not guilty. His lawyers tried to suppress his confession, arguing police didn't properly read him his rights. The case continues. The attack sent shockwaves through the literary world. If Salman Rushdie, the most high-profile target who lived under protection for years, could be attacked at a public event in America, who was safe? What message did that send? And it forced everyone to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Rushdie affair never actually ended. The violence against Rushdie wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a much larger, ongoing pattern of artists, writers, cartoonists, filmmakers, and intellectuals being threatened, attacked, or killed for their creative work. Let's run through some of the lowlights, shall we? In 2004, Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh was murdered in Amsterdam by a Dutch-Moroccan man for making a short film called Submission, which criticized the treatment of women in Islamic societies. The killer shot him 8 times, slit his throat, and stabbed notes into his chest. In January 2015, 2 gunmen attacked the offices of Charlie Hebdo in Paris, France, killing 12 people, including some of France's most celebrated cartoonists. The magazine had published cartoons of Muhammad. The attackers claimed they were avenging the prophet. In 2015, a Bangladeshi-American blogger named Abhijit Roy was hacked to death with machetes in Dhaka, Bangladesh, for his atheist writings. Several other secular bloggers in Bangladesh met similar fates. In 2020, a French teacher named Samuel Paty was beheaded near Paris, France, for showing Charlie Hebdo cartoons in a class on freedom of expression. This isn't about any single religion, by the way. Artists have been censored, threatened, and killed by Christian extremists, abortion providers, artists who've created works seen as blasphemous, Hindu nationalists, the murder of journalist Gauri Lankesh, attacks on filmmakers and scholars, Buddhist extremists, violence against Rohingya journalists, and authoritarian regimes of all flavors. But there's something specific about the Rushdie case that makes it particularly significant. It established a precedent. It showed that a religious authority could issue a death sentence for creative work, and that sentence could persist for decades, could inspire violence across generations, could never truly be rescinded. The Fatwa created a template. It said, if you create something we deem offensive, you are never safe, anywhere, ever. Not in 1989, not in 2022, not in 2026. The threat is permanent. And that has a chilling effect, literally called the chilling effect in First Amendment law. When artists and writers self-censor because they fear for their lives, when publishers reject manuscripts because they're worried about security costs, when museums refuse to show certain artwork because they don't want their staff endangered, that's the chilling effect in action. A few examples. Yale University Press published a book about the Danish cartoons controversy, but refused to actually include the cartoons, citing safety concerns. Random House canceled publication of a novel called The Jewel of Medina about Aisha, Muhammad's wife, after concerns about potential violence. Many publishers now have security protocols in place before publishing anything touching on Islam, protocols that don't exist for other religions. Is this rational risk assessment or surrender to violent censorship? Both? Neither. It depends who you ask. What's undeniable is that the Rushdie affair changed the calculus. Before 1989, literary fiction was considered pretty low stakes. After 1989, everyone involved in publishing had to consider, could this book get our employees killed? Okay, stuffers, we need to talk about the philosophical elephant in the room. Should there be limits on free expression? And before you scream First Amendment at your screen, let's acknowledge that this question is way more complicated than it seems. First, the legal framework. In the United States, the First Amendment protects most speech, including offensive speech. You can blaspheme all you want. You can insult religions, politicians, ideas. It's protected. The main exceptions are things like true threats, incitement to imminent lawless action, defamation, and obscenity in limited contexts. In Europe and most other democracies, the legal framework is different. Many countries have hate speech laws, blasphemy laws, though these are increasingly being repealed, and stronger protections for religious feelings. In those frameworks, the Satanic Verses might actually be illegal, depending on the country. But legal rights and ethical questions are different things. Just because you can say something doesn't mean you should, and this is where it gets messy. One argument goes like this: free expression is the foundation of liberal democracy. The ability to criticize, question, satirize, and challenge is essential to human flourishing and progress. The moment you create exceptions based on who might be offended, you've created a veto power for the most easily offended, which inevitably leads to authoritarian control. Therefore, there should be no religious exceptions to free expression. If you're offended, don't read it. The counter-argument: free expression doesn't exist in a vacuum. When you have massive power imbalances, when a wealthy, celebrated author in the West satirizes the sacred beliefs of marginalized, economically disadvantaged communities who face daily discrimination, that's not speaking truth to power, that's punching down. And while legal censorship is wrong, maybe there's such a thing as ethical restraint. Maybe some speech, while legally protected, is still harmful and shouldn't be celebrated. Both arguments have merit. Both are held by smart, thoughtful people, and the Rushdie case sits right at the intersection, making both sides uncomfortable. Here's the thing that drives me crazy about this debate. Both sides often strawman each other. Free speech absolutists act like anyone who suggests ethical boundaries is a censorious authoritarian who wants to ban all criticism of religion. Critics act like anyone defending Rushdie wants the unfettered right to mock marginalized communities with no social consequences. But there's a huge middle ground where most people actually live. You can think Rushdie had the absolute legal right to write the Satanic Verses, that the Fatwa was an unconscionable crime, that violence in response to speech is always wrong, while also thinking that parts of the book were needlessly provocative, that Rushdie didn't fully consider how his work would land in communities already under siege, and that just because you can do something doesn't always mean you should. You can hold all those thoughts simultaneously without contradiction. Stuffers, this is a genuine question. Where do you draw the line? Should artists self-censor to avoid offending religious believers? Should religious believers accept that their sacred figures aren't off-limits in secular art? Is there a middle ground? Comments below, and seriously, keep it respectful. One more dimension: cultural context. Rushdie was raised Muslim but had become largely secular. From his perspective, he was engaging critically with his own tradition, the way lapsed Christians write novels questioning Christianity, lapsed Jews write satirical takes on Judaism. That's normal in Western literary tradition. But for many Muslims, especially those who see themselves as defending their faith against Western imperialism and secularism, this looked like apostasy and betrayal, like he'd taken the West's side against his own people. The offense wasn't just about the content, it was about where he was standing when he said it. And here's the uncomfortable truth: liberal democracies still haven't figured out how to navigate these tensions. We want free expression, we want pluralism, we want religious tolerance, we want social cohesion. Sometimes those values point in different directions, and we don't have a principled way to resolve the conflicts. The Rushdie affair exposed that uncertainty, and we're still living in it. Let's talk about why 37 years later, the Fatwa is still in effect. Because that's genuinely bizarre when you think about it. Khomeini died in June 1989, just 4 months after issuing the Fatwa. Under Islamic jurisprudence, a Fatwa issued by one authority can be overturned or reinterpreted by subsequent authorities. Iran has had multiple supreme leaders and presidents since then, some more moderate than others. So why hasn't it been rescinded? The cynical answer: because it's politically useful. The Fatwa has become a symbol of Iranian defiance against the West. Retracting it would look like surrender, like bowing to Western pressure. For hardliners in Iran, the Revolutionary Guard, conservative clerics, anyone invested in maintaining the Islamic Republic's ideological purity, the Fatwa is a line in the sand. It says, we don't care about your liberal values, your international condemnation, your economic sanctions. We answer to God, not you. Every time a reformist Iranian leader has tried to soften the stance, like Khatami's 1998 statement, hardliners have pushed back. In 2012, when Rushdie published a memoir, an Iranian semi-official religious foundation increased the bounty to $3.3 million. In 2016, Iranian state media ran 40 new outlets promoting the fatwa. After the 2022 attack on Rushdie, Iranian media celebrated. Conservative newspapers praised the attacker. When pressed by international journalists, Iranian officials gave non-answers. "We don't have anything to do with this, but also he deserved it for insulting Islam." It's plausible deniability. Iran doesn't need to actively fund assassins anymore. The fatwa exists as a permanent directive, and eventually someone inspired by it will act. Then Iran can claim innocence while signaling approval. But there's another dimension: Iran's relationship with the broader Islamic world. By maintaining the fatwa, Iran positions itself as the uncompromising defender of Islamic honor. This matters in the competition between Iran, Shia revolutionary, and Saudi Arabia, Sunni traditionalist, for leadership of the Islamic world. Neither wants to be seen as soft on perceived insults to Islam. It's a religious credibility arms race, and the fatwa is part of Iran's arsenal. There's also the domestic angle. Iran's regime faces periodic protests, economic crises, legitimacy challenges. The fatwa is a way to rally the base, to remind everyone of the revolution's original spirit, to create an external enemy, Western blasphemy, when internal grievances get too loud. And here's the thing that's deeply frustrating. Rushdie has become a symbol in a conflict that's not really about him or his book. He's a proxy for larger battles over religion, modernity, Western power, post-colonial resentment, and geopolitical influence. Most Iranians, especially younger Iranians, probably don't care about the Satanic Verses. Many have never even heard of it. But the regime maintains the fatwa because it serves political purposes that have nothing to do with literary criticism. Rushdie is trapped in a conflict he didn't choose, for a book most of his enemies haven't read, for reasons that are ultimately about power, not piety. Okay, stuffers, it's time for me to put on my tinfoil hat. Except this isn't tinfoil, it's more like high-quality analytical aluminum. This is my personal theory, grounded in observable patterns and rational analysis. Here's my conspiracy theory, though maybe systemic analysis is more accurate. The Satanic Verses controversy was not an unpredictable lightning strike. It was the inevitable result of systemic factors in publishing, geopolitics, and cultural dynamics that converged in the late 1980s, and all the key players either willfully ignored the warnings or actively welcomed the controversy. Let me break this down. Point 1. The publishing industry knew this would be controversial. Viking Penguin wasn't stupid. They had the manuscript for months before publication. They had advanced readers. They knew the book contained provocative content about Islam and Muhammad. They knew Rushdie was already controversial. His previous book, Shame, had been banned in Pakistan. So why didn't they anticipate problems? Or did they, and just not care because controversy sells books? Think about it. There's no such thing as bad publicity in publishing. A banned book, a controversial book, a book that generates headlines, that's a bestseller waiting to happen. The Satanic Verses was already getting literary attention, but the controversy turned it into a cultural phenomenon. Sales exploded. It became one of the best-selling books of all time. Now, I'm not saying Viking Penguin wanted death threats and murders. That would be absurd and evil. But I am saying they likely anticipated some level of controversy and saw that as a marketing opportunity. They just catastrophically underestimated the scale. Point 2. British authorities used Rushdie as a cultural wedge. The British government spent millions protecting Rushdie. Why? Pure principle? or because he became a useful symbol in cultural and political battles. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Britain was grappling with immigration, multiculturalism, national identity. The Rushdie affair became a litmus test. Are you with British liberal values, free speech, secularism, or against them? By aggressively defending Rushdie, the British government positioned itself as the defender of Enlightenment values against Islamic extremism. This was politically useful. It allowed them to sidestep uncomfortable questions about racism, economic inequality, and the failures of integration by framing everything through the lens of free speech versus religious extremism. Rushdie became a mascot for Western liberalism, whether he wanted to or not. Point 3. Iran saw an opportunity and seized it. As I mentioned earlier, Khomeini's revolution was in trouble in 1989. The war with Iraq had ended badly. The economy was devastated. Revolutionary fervor was declining. The Satanic Verses controversy was a gift. It allowed Iran to reassert ideological leadership of the global Muslim community, embarrass moderate Muslim leaders who'd been slow to condemn the book, distract from domestic problems, position itself as the defender of Islamic honor against Western blasphemy, create an external crisis that unified the regime. Did Iran create the controversy? No. But did they opportunistically exploit it for maximum geopolitical benefit? Absolutely. The fatwa was calculated, not spontaneous. Khomeini didn't issue it immediately. He waited until there were deaths in Pakistan, until the controversy had reached critical mass internationally. Then he seized the moment. Point 4. The confluence was predictable. Here's the conspiracy theory part. I think sophisticated actors in publishing, government, and media knew these dynamics were in play, and they proceeded anyway because the controversy served their interests. Publishers got sales and publicity. Western governments got a clear-cut free speech versus extremism narrative. Iran got geopolitical leverage. The media got an ongoing story that generated endless content. The only people who suffered were Rushdie himself, trapped in hiding. Translators and publishers who were attacked or killed. Muslim communities who faced increased suspicion and discrimination. Anyone who genuinely cared about nuanced discussion of faith, art, and expression. Now, am I saying there was a smoke-filled room where Viking Penguin, MI6, and the media agreed to orchestrate this? No, that's absurd. But I am saying that systems can create incentives that lead to predictable outcomes even without explicit coordination. Publishing incentivizes controversy. Governments incentivize symbolic battles over values. Authoritarian regimes incentivize external enemies. The media incentivizes conflict narratives. When you put all those incentives together, the Satanic Verses affair becomes not a shocking aberration, but an almost inevitable collision. The conspiracy, if there is one, is systemic, built into the structure of how these institutions operate, and that makes it harder to fix because you can't just arrest the bad guys. You have to change the incentives. Point 5. We're still in the same system. The 2022 attack on Rushdie proves nothing has fundamentally changed. The same incentives exist. Authors still write provocative material. Publishers still promote it. Governments still take symbolic stands. Extremists still respond with violence. The media still covers it breathlessly. We're trapped in a cycle and nobody has figured out how to break it. So that's my conspiracy theory. The Satanic Verses affair was the predictable result of intersecting systemic incentives, and everyone involved, from publishers to governments to media, either failed to anticipate the consequences or didn't care because controversy served their interests. And until we change those fundamental incentives, we'll keep seeing versions of this story play out again and again. Stuffers, do you buy this? Am I seeing patterns that aren't there? Or is there something to this systemic analysis? Drop your thoughts below, but seriously, nothing dangerous or threatening. So where do things stand as of January 2026? Salman Rushdie is 78 years old. He's alive, but permanently injured from the 2022 attack. He's published a memoir about the experience. He continues to write and speak publicly, often about free expression and the threats facing artists and journalists. The fatwa is still in effect. Iran has never rescinded it. The bounty still exists, at least nominally. Rushdie still faces some level of security concern whenever he appears in public, though not the around-the-clock protection of the 1990s. Hadi Matar, his attacker, is still awaiting trial in New York. The legal process grinds slowly forward. In the broader culture, the Rushdie affair has become a historical reference point, invoked whenever questions of free speech, religious sensitivity, or artistic freedom come up. It's the case everyone cites, the precedent everyone references. But here's what concerns me. We haven't actually resolved any of the underlying tensions. We've just normalized them. Artists self-censor, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. Publishers make security calculations that would have seemed absurd in 1985. Religious extremism remains a threat to creative expression globally. And liberal democracies still haven't figured out how to balance free expression with social cohesion and respect for religious minorities. If anything, the landscape has gotten more complicated. Social media now allows outrage to spread globally in hours rather than weeks. Political polarization has intensified everywhere, making nuanced discussion harder. Authoritarian regimes have gotten better at using digital surveillance to track dissidents and artists. Cancel culture debates have muddied the waters around what constitutes legitimate criticism versus censorship. We're living in a world where an author can be simultaneously celebrated as a free speech hero and condemned as a provocateur. A book can be both a bestseller and too dangerous to stock in many stores. Governments defend free expression while also pressuring platforms to remove harmful content. Religious communities demand respect while also claiming the right to dictate what can be said about their traditions. These contradictions haven't been resolved. They've just been internalized, normalized, accepted as the permanent state of things. And that, in some ways, might be the lasting impact of the Satanic Verses. It showed us we don't actually have a consensus on these fundamental questions, and maybe we never will. Okay, stuffers, let's zoom out. What can we actually learn from this whole insane saga? Lesson 1. Ideas are powerful and dangerous. We live in a culture that's simultaneously obsessed with the power of stories and words, and also dismissive of them. It's just a book, people say. Just ignore it if you're offended. But the Rushdie affair proves that's naive. Ideas do have power. Stories do shape how people see the world. And sometimes those ideas are dangerous. Not because they're wrong, but because they challenge deeply held beliefs in ways that make people feel existentially threatened. This doesn't justify violence, never justifies violence. But it does mean we need to take seriously the fact that creative work operates in the real world with real consequences. Lesson 2. Free expression is never free. Every society that values free expression is built on the willingness of some people to risk their safety, livelihood, or lives to exercise that freedom. Publishers who print controversial books, journalists who investigate dangerous topics, artists who challenge authority, they pay the price for everyone else's freedom. And societies that claim to value free expression but aren't willing to protect those people, with legal frameworks, with resources, with solidarity, are lying about their values. Lesson 3. Religious tolerance cuts both ways. Liberal democracies want religious pluralism. We want people of all faiths and no faith to coexist peacefully. But that requires a shared understanding. You can believe whatever you want about the sacred, but you can't force others to share those beliefs or punish them for disagreeing. The Fatwa violated that principle fundamentally. It said our conception of blasphemy applies to everyone, everywhere, regardless of their beliefs or legal jurisdiction. That's theocracy, not pluralism. But here's the thing. Liberal democracies also have to grapple with their own contradictions. If you're demanding that religious minorities accept criticism of their sacred beliefs, while those same minorities face discrimination, economic marginalization, and constant suspicion, are you really creating the conditions for peaceful coexistence? Or are you asking people to accept insult on top of injury? Lesson 4. Geopolitics makes everything worse. The Rushdie affair wasn't just about a book. It was about Iran's position in the global order, Western versus Islamic civilizational identity, post-colonial resentment and power dynamics, domestic politics in Britain, Iran, and a dozen other countries, media narratives, and symbolic politics. When individual human beings get caught in these massive structural forces, they get crushed. Rushdie became a symbol, and symbols can be martyred in ways that actual humans shouldn't have to endure. Lesson 5. We're terrible at nuance. The Rushdie affair forced everyone into binary positions. Team Rushdie or Team Religious Respect. Team Rushdie or Team Fatwa. You had to pick a side. But reality is messier. You can think Rushdie had every right to write the book and that parts of it were needlessly offensive. You can condemn the Fatwa and understand the historical resentments that made some Muslims feel attacked. You can defend free expression and recognize that marginalized communities deserve not to be constantly mocked. Holding multiple truths simultaneously is uncomfortable. Binary thinking is easier. But binary thinking also leads to the kind of polarization that makes violence more likely. Lesson 6. The long game matters. Khomeini has been dead for 37 years. The geopolitical context of 1989 has completely changed. The Soviet Union doesn't exist. The internet has transformed communication. A whole generation has been born since the Fatwa. But the Fatwa persists. Because once you unleash certain forces, religious hatred, political extremism, symbolic violence, they take on a life of their own. They outlast their creators. They become structural features of the landscape. Breaking those cycles requires sustained effort, moral courage, and a willingness to challenge systems that benefit from ongoing conflict. Lesson 7. Art matters. Through all of this, the Satanic Verses remains a novel, a work of imagination, a human being trying to make sense of migration, faith, identity, and transformation through fiction. Maybe it succeeds, maybe it fails, maybe it's brilliant, maybe it's flawed. Reasonable people can disagree, but it deserves to be read, or not read, on its own terms, as art, as literature, as one writer's attempt to grapple with the biggest questions humans face. The fact that we can't even have that conversation, that the book is buried under layers of politics, violence, and symbolic warfare, is a tragedy. Not the biggest tragedy, obviously. People died, lives were destroyed. But it's a tragedy, because ultimately this story is about the human impulse to create meaning through stories, and the equally human impulse to destroy anything that challenges our certainties. And 37 years on, we still haven't figured out how to honor both those impulses without bloodshed.
Okay, stuffers. I need to take off my narrator hat for a moment and speak personally. You know I don't usually get super transparent about my faith on this channel. This isn't a Christian channel, it's a curiosity channel. But this topic demands it. I am a follower of Jesus. I believe the gospel is true. I believe scripture is authoritative. I believe God is worthy of reverence and that sacred things deserve respect. And I also believe, deeply, that violence in defense of God's honor is a fundamental misunderstanding of who God is. Here's why. The God I worship doesn't need me to protect his reputation. He's not so fragile that a novel threatens him. He's not so insecure that mockery diminishes him. He's the creator of the universe. He spoke galaxies into existence. He doesn't need me to stab someone who writes something blasphemous. More than that,
Jesus, the full revelation of God in my tradition, responded to mockery, insult, and even execution not with violence, but with forgiveness. When soldiers beat him, spat on him, nailed him to a cross, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Luke 23:34. That's not weakness. That's the most powerful response imaginable. It says, your hatred can't touch who I am. Your violence can't diminish my love. I will absorb your worst and respond with grace. If that's who God is, and I believe it is, then how could I possibly justify violence against someone who insults him? How could I claim to follow Jesus while stabbing people who write books I find offensive? I can't, and neither can anyone who truly understands the gospel. Now, does that mean nothing is sacred? That I should celebrate blasphemy? That I have no right to feel offended when something I hold dear is mocked? No. I can feel grief when sacred things are treated carelessly. I can choose not to support art that degrades what I love. I can engage in conversation, write responses, create counter-narratives. I can exercise my own free expression in defense of what I believe. What I can't do is violence. What I can't do is demand that people who don't share my faith live by its rules. What I can't do is confuse protecting God with protecting my own ego and sense of control. Here's a verse that's been on my mind through this whole deep dive. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, "It is mine to avenge. I will repay," says the Lord. Romans 12:17-19. That's the standard. Not defend God's honor through violence, not punish blasphemers, but live at peace and trust that God is big enough to handle his own reputation. And you know what? I think that applies to all faiths, all sacred traditions. If your God is truly God, he doesn't need you to kill for him. If your faith is truly strong, it can withstand criticism, mockery, even blasphemy without violence. The Fatwa against Rushdie wasn't a defense of God. It was a political power play dressed in religious language. And the violence it inspired isn't piety. It's the opposite. It's humans playing God, deciding who deserves to live or die based on what they write. That's not faith. That's idolatry, making God in our image as a reflection of our own anger and insecurity. So here's my personal conviction. I can love God, revere Scripture, hold my faith as sacred, and also defend Salman Rushdie's right to write the Satanic Verses. Those aren't contradictions. They're both expressions of the same underlying belief that human beings are made in God's image and therefore possess inherent dignity that violence violates. I don't have to like the book. I don't have to agree with it. I don't have to think it's good or fair or wise. But I do have to recognize Rushdie's humanity. And that means opposing anyone who would kill him for his words. Because ultimately, this isn't about religion versus secularism or faith versus freedom. It's about whether we believe human life is sacred enough to protect even when we are offended. I do, and I think God does too.
So here we are, Stuffers. 37 years after a novel was published. 37 years after a fatwa was issued. 37 years of violence, hiding, fear, debate, and ongoing tension. Salman Rushdie is still alive, still writing, still bearing the scars, literal and metaphorical, of a controversy he never could have fully anticipated. The Satanic Verses is still in print, still available, still being read by people who want to understand what all the fuss was about. And you know what? Most of them probably come away thinking, this is fine. It's complex and weird and kind of brilliant in places, but it's not worth killing anyone over, because no book is. The fatwa endures, not because it makes theological sense, not because it serves justice,
but because it's become a symbol in conflicts that have nothing to do with literature and everything to do with power. And we collectively still haven't figured out how to talk about these issues without immediately polarizing into warring camps. But maybe that's okay. Maybe the point isn't to reach perfect consensus. Maybe it's to keep struggling with these questions about freedom and faith, about offense and tolerance, about where we draw lines and how we live together despite profound disagreements. Maybe the real lesson of the Rushdie affair is that these tensions are permanent features of pluralistic societies, and our job isn't to resolve them once and for all, but to manage them with wisdom, humility, and grace. To protect free expression while recognizing its costs, to honor sacred beliefs while refusing to impose them on others, to defend the right to offend while questioning whether we should, to condemn violence absolutely while trying to understand the grievances that fuel it, to hold multiple truths in tension even when it's uncomfortable. That's hard. It's way harder than picking a side and demonizing everyone who disagrees, but it's the work of building actual, functioning, diverse societies where people of different faiths and worldviews can coexist without violence. And if Rushdie's suffering and the suffering of everyone caught up in this nightmare can teach us anything, maybe it's that the alternative to that hard work isn't peace, it's blood. So let's do the work. Let's protect writers and artists. Let's defend free expression. Let's also listen to people who feel genuinely hurt by art that mocks what they hold sacred. Let's condemn violence absolutely. Let's honor faith without letting it become a weapon. Let's tell stories that challenge and comfort and provoke and heal. Let's be brave enough to create and humble enough to learn from the consequences. Because in the end, that's what art is, the courageous attempt to make meaning in a chaotic world. And that's what freedom is, the fragile, precious space where we can all make that attempt without fear of death. Salman Rushdie is still here. He's still writing. Despite everything, the threats, the violence, the decade in hiding, the stabbing that nearly killed him, he's still making meaning through words. That's defiance. That's courage. That's faith in the power of stories to matter, even when they cost everything. And maybe in a world that sometimes seems determined to tear itself apart, that's the hope we need. The stubborn insistence that ideas matter, that art matters, that human dignity matters enough to fight for, not with weapons, but with words. Okay, thanks for watching. Peace out. Goodbye, guys.